Art Serna Jr. is a San Antonio, Texas-based executive leader and systems change architect who has spent nearly 3 decades working at the intersection of service, education, and community development. As founder and chief strategy officer of Cosmos Renewed and a partner to emerging microschools and learning ecosystems, he focuses on building durable structures that outlive any single program or funding cycle. Across school cafeterias, health clinics, and community centers, the pattern in Art Serna's career is strikingly consistent. He keeps showing up in the same places where families gather, services are delivered, and decisions about resources quietly ripple through lives. That pattern began in AmeriCorps. Nearly 3 decades after his first service term, he still marks time by that early pledge. The language of service is not a nostalgic footnote for him. It is the baseline for how he assesses institutions, leaders, and new ideas. When he talks about what matters most in community work, he returns again and again to simple acts of presence, the willingness to stand in the same room with people who are carrying the weight of poverty, isolation, or institutional neglect. Over the years, that presence has expanded into a kind of long view. Rather than treating service as a project or a season, Serna approaches it as a lifelong discipline. AmeriCorps gave him an entry point, but it did not give him a script. The script he has written is one in which direct service is only the first layer, followed by a determined effort to redesign the systems that made the service necessary in the first place. The early AmeriCorps experience eventually carried Serna into executive roles that demanded more than individual effort. As his responsibilities grew, the problems he faced took on a larger scale. Budgets stretched into the millions, and the stakes involved not just after-school programs or single campuses, but entire neighborhoods and regions. At City on a Hill in Milwaukee, he directed all strategic and operational functions of a social enterprise that combined medical, behavioral, and dental care for underserved communities. The work demanded the unglamorous discipline of managing a $4 million profit and loss statement, while also holding the human reality of families who relied on those services as their primary lifeline. Under his leadership, fundraising became a tool for structural change rather than short-term relief. A diverse fundraising portfolio generated more than $10.8 million to support the mission of ending poverty. He helped steer a $2.1 million facility renovation, ensuring that capital improvements translated into tangible benefits for patients and neighbors rather than cosmetic upgrades. When the organization celebrated its 20th anniversary, he engineered an event that increased revenue by 321% over the prior year, treating the gala not as a party, but as a lever for long-term sustainability. Before and after Milwaukee, Serna applied a similar lens to education. In Teach for America roles, he managed a multi-million-dollar regional operation and a team of 24 staff that supported a talent pipeline impacting over 14,000 students annually across central Oklahoma. The work required attention to both classroom-level outcomes and the policy and partnership structures that made those outcomes possible. Taken together, these chapters reveal a leader who treats budgets, events, and program portfolios as instruments in a larger composition. The melody is always the same. How do you move from serving individuals to reshaping the systems that define their options? In his recent work, Serna has shifted from running single institutions to building wider ecosystems. As founder and chief strategy officer of Cosmos Renewed, a Milwaukee-based strategic advisory focused on emerging schools and learning initiatives, he now spends more of his time with leaders who are trying to design the next generation of educational models. Cosmos Renewed does not present itself as a traditional consultancy that drops in with a fixed framework. Instead, the organization positions itself as a partner for visionary leaders and institutions facing urgent transitions. The goal is to co-create strategy by pairing executive coaching with program design and cross-sector partnerships. One branch of that work is Parents Re-Empowered, a network that supports microschools and parent-driven learning communities. In that setting, Serna works with founders who are often operating from church basements, shared workspaces, or repurposed community rooms rather than conventional campuses. These schools may serve small groups of learners, but the questions they raise are expansive. How can families have more agency over curriculum and schedules? How can small learning communities access resources usually reserved for large districts? How can accountability and safety be maintained without recreating the same bureaucratic layers that micro schools are trying to leave behind? Serna treats these questions as design prompts rather than obstacles. The micro school space becomes a living laboratory where he and his partners can test new approaches to governance, funding, and community engagement at a scale that still feels personal. In both his resume and public writing, Serna describes his work in language more often associated with technology labs than community nonprofits. He speaks of paradigm shifts, urgent transitions, and AI-augmented strategy design. It is an intentional blend. Over time, his practice has evolved from program management to systems architecture. He draws from systems thinking traditions popularized in works like The Fifth Discipline, not as abstract theory, but as a practical toolkit for leaders facing complexity. Rather than treating problems in isolation, he pushes organizations to map feedback loops, unintended consequences, and the often hidden incentives that shape behavior. Artificial intelligence enters this picture not as a shiny object, but as a new form of infrastructure. In his writing on microschools and AI, Serna points toward a future where tools such as small language models help educators and parents navigate information overload without outsourcing judgment. He highlights experiments from research labs that focus on smaller, more transparent models, which can be tuned for specific communities instead of sprawling, opaque systems. The emphasis is on augmentation. I can support decision-making, pattern recognition, and content creation, but in his framing, it should not replace the human relationships at the core of education. For microschools that already rely heavily on trust between families and educators, this distinction is critical. AI is most valuable when it frees up time for listening, mentoring, and presence, the very practices he has spent his career defending. Across roles, Serna's leadership style centers on listening for leverage points, the small shifts that can produce outsized effects. In healthcare, that might mean designing a renovation that improves patient flow and staff collaboration, rather than simply adding square footage. In education, it might mean aligning state-level investments with local talent pipelines so that funding does not drift away from the classrooms it was meant to serve. His board service reflects the same instincts. He has held roles with organizations such as Beyond Vision, Creative Oklahoma, the One Star National Service Commission, and Rosebuds Incorporated. In each setting, he has navigated the space between volunteers, staff, and policymakers, translating the urgency of lived experience into language that can influence budgets and legislation. The through line is a refusal to separate technical solutions from relational work. Strategy sessions, legislative briefings, and capital campaigns sit alongside conversations with parents in school parking lots or patients in clinic waiting rooms. For Serna, those conversations are not background noise. They are the raw data that any credible plan must incorporate. Looking across almost 30 years of work, Serna's career reads less like a series of discrete jobs and more like a sustained inquiry. What would it take for service to be built into the operating system of a community rather than layered on top as charity? His response has unfolded in stages. AmeriCorps gave him an initial platform to act. Teach for America and City on a Hill offered laboratories where he could test how leadership, funding, and program design interact. Cosmos Renewed and Parents Re-Empowered now provide a vantage point from which to help others design their own systems with those lessons in mind. He tends to work in places where gaps are most visible, whether that is a clinic where patients lack basic access to care, or a micro school founder trying to stitch together a viable budget from tuition, donations, and state programs. The work is patient and often slow, but it is aimed at durability. Instead of chasing the next initiative, he keeps asking what structure would need to exist so that the next generation does not have to reinvent the wheel. In a moment when both education and public service are under strain, Serna's career offers a different posture. It suggests that the most enduring innovations may come from leaders who combine the patience of community organizers with the curiosity of technologists. For families experimenting with microschools, for nonprofits wrestling with AI, and for policymakers debating how to fund the next wave of social infrastructure. His work provides a living example of how to hold competing pressures in the same frame: service and systems, technology and presence, local details and statewide policy all sit side by side rather than in opposition.